Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia Matrix-12-V tutorial series. Having a look at the last of the main components today, the tracking generator. Saved till last for a reason. Hope you're enjoying this series. If you are, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Awesome way to help support me. Let's deal with firstly what a tracking generator is in the real world. Typically you'll see them associated with spectrum analyzers, and they hook into the spectrum analyzer. As a spectrum analyzer is basically sweeping through all of the possible frequencies that it can analyze, let's say in the audio world from 20 Hz up to 20K, it basically, maybe 50 times a second, analyzes every single one of those frequencies and generates an amplitude according to the signal that it identifies for that particular frequency. That's what a spectrum analyzer is. If you connect a tracking generator to that thing, the tracking generator has another ramp oscillator. That's basically what's happening as we sweep through all of these frequencies in the spectrum analyzer. The tracking generator's got another ramp oscillator operating at exactly the same speed. In other words, it tracks the spectrum analyzer. It then outputs whatever frequency, treat that as a control voltage if you like, that the spectrum analyzer is analyzing at that given moment in time. That can then be used as a linear analyzer. You could, for instance, send that signal into a filter circuit and you would see the shape of the filter circuit. It's a way to basically multi-purpose spectrum analyzers. Now, the tracking generator in the Matrix-12 isn't exactly that, because instead of this continuous range operating over an essentially infinite series, we get 5 discrete moments in time, and they're called points. Can you see points 1 to 5? And the way that I think it's going to be helpful to try to imagine what's going on here is to imagine a modulator in the background. Let's think of an LFO, a triangular LFO. If you split that LFO into 4 equal segments, then the points correspond to all of the vertical lines that you just drew. So point 1 is at the beginning of the triangle, point 2 is going to come a quarter of the way through, and so on until we get to point 5, which is the end of the triangle. As we know, the end of a wave is also the beginning. We've wrapped around on ourselves, and we've defined 4 equal segments or quadrants. Now, inside each one of those blocks of data, it's got 0 to 63. That's its amplitude range, so treat that as like the bit rate if you're thinking in sample terms. The number of different control voltages that it can identify, that the tracking generator can identify at any given moment. I think I've already said too many words. What I need to do is plug this thing in, show you it in real time, and then we'll come back and start figuring out how it actually works in practice. Now, it's a little bit ironic that coming to the end of the main interface analysis, I finally got around to defining my own init program. I've fine-tuned it up to the point where it's actually generating a proper C. You can see +0 on the tuner. And I've also thrown away some of the LFO mappings into VCA2. There are 3 default LFO mappings. I don't want them here today. The other thing that I've done, because I knew I was starting here today, is that I've mapped LFO directly into frequency, but as you can see, it's not currently in use. And this is where we're going to start our analysis today. I'm going to get an LFO up and running with an up source. So this is a ramp LFO. And when I dial this amount into the LFO, we're basically going to get a pitch sweep through the oscillator. Now I'm just going to get a baseline. So we're currently cycling at 130 Hz. That's our default C. Have a look at the retrig options I've got. Retrig set to 32, which basically means that's the very bottom, the absolute lowest point of the ramp. So we're basically kind of at -1, if you like. I'm going to crank this amplitude up. I'm going to press a key. And then as soon as I press the key, you can see the frequency is about 82 Hz. It's the smallest number I can get it to generate. That's below the C that I want to play. And then we're going to go up. We're going to get to the modulation point 0, which is going to be generating the C. And then the ramp will continue up. Here we go. We finally get to about 201 Hz, which is the absolute limit of the amount of modulation this LFO can apply, and then it jumps all the way back down to 82 Hz and starts again. The reason it was so important for me to define with absolute precision what the LFO was doing is because the tracking generator is going to hook into it. Now, here's one of the most important things to bear in mind about tracking generators. They only operate effectively on variable modulation sources. There's no point sending a single static value, such as the control voltage of a keyboard stroke, into a tracking generator. You could, and in fact by default it's mapped to the keyboard. Pointless. The tracking generator is all about observing changes in modulation over time. It tracks modulation changes. And so what we're going to do now is insert this tracking generator in between the LFO and the oscillator. So I'm going to set my input to the tracking generator as LFO. This is just like what we did with the lag processor. So LFO1 is tied into the tracking generator. And now in my modulation page, I'm going to change this to track 1. And now this tracking generator is directly in between the LFO and the oscillator. But listen to this, it's going to sound exactly the same. So here's what's happened. We've now got a second oscillator. Treat it as an oscillator, but instead of it generating control voltages, it's actually identifying or observing the control voltages of another module. It's running alongside the LFO at exactly the same speed. The tracking generator knows how fast the LFO is operating. This is all internally wired in the synthesizer. You don't have to do this. When you specify LFO1 as an input to the tracking generator implicitly understands how fast the LFO is cycling. It then splits that period up into 4 equal segments as defined by these points down here. And the values that we're tying into this tracking generator, it's no coincidence that these values describe a diagonal line. You see they go up in basically 16s. Imagine that 16, 32, 48, 64 would be the traditional view, but we're zero based here. And so this tracking generator is literally running alongside the LFO, constantly looking over its shoulder, identifying what the control voltage is that's coming out of the oscillator that it's running alongside. It's then taking snapshots of these control voltages as it goes, and it's saying understood, understood, understood. But now that it's taken all those snapshots and it understands completely the shape of the LFO that's just been drawn, it can reproduce that at any rate it so desires. So here's demonstration number 1. I'm going to set point 2 to 63 and all the other points to 0. Now what we're going to get is over a quarter of the period of the underlying LFO, we're going to go from minimum pitch, about 82 Hz, to maximum pitch, which is about 202 Hz. In the second quarter of time, we're going to go all the way back down to 82 Hz, and then we're going to stick at 82 Hz for the final 2 quarters, or half of the period of the LFO. Here we go. Up, down, flat. Up, down, flat. So we've redrawn this LFO dynamically according to basically we're stretching time. We're saying in this quadrant of time, do this. And you can get absolutely crazy. You can invert these values. So now it's going to go from 202 Hz down to 82 Hz, stick completely static for a period of time. Let's have a little bump. So then we'll come up off 82 Hz, around into the maybe 90s or something, back down to 82, and then we'll jump up again. Here we go. So we're going to start at 202, down to 82, hold there for a moment, come up, 94, back down to 82, and then we jumped, we cycled around and we started again. So we can literally reconfigure the underlying LFO in any way that we want. This tracking generator with all of these little snapshots of time has a perfect record of what's happened behind the scenes, and then it can set that LFO aside, and then you can redraw it in basically any shape that you want. It stands to reason that if I configure these values backwards, So we're going to want a 47, a 31, a 15 and a 0. That's going to take this up saw and it's going to turn it into a down saw. Over each one of those quadrants, it's quite literally going to draw its shape that it has in memory. It's going to draw it backwards. Here we go. So it's a really powerful method of manipulating variable modulation sources behind the scenes. Notice I was careful not to say LFO. Any variable modulation source will work. Now here's where things get a little bit tricky, because next we're going to go on to look at the square wave, and this is a peculiar use case because a square wave is a modulator. It draws a wave, but it only actually has a very small number of data points inside it. As far as the Matrix-12 is concerned, it's only interested in a square wave at exactly halfway through the cycle, when it goes from maximum control voltage down to 0, and then at the very end of the cycle when it goes from 0 up to maximum again. For the intervening period of time, the tracking generator is oblivious and does not care about all of these internal volumes. So even though it's running alongside the square wave, it ignores it until there's anything interesting to do. And this is the whole point about it being a variable modulation analyzer. That's another really difficult kind of abstract concept to wrap your head around, so I'll give you an example. We're going to set all of these data points to 0. Oh, just as a matter of interest, if I press a key now, we're just going to get a flat 82 Hertz. I'll do that quickly. You get the idea. Okay, let's dial in the square wave. I'm going to make it fast, and just for a moment, I'll take the tracker away and we'll plumb it directly in. Let's have a listen to what it sounds like. Okay, back to the tracking generator. Now I'm going to start manipulating the tracking points, and very quickly something's going to appear pretty strange. Don't forget this square wave is cycling pretty quickly, so we should be hearing changes by now. It doesn't matter what I set points 1, 2 and 4 to. The tracking generator has nothing interesting to observe on the square wave during those periods of time. The only interesting data points it has live inside points 3 and 5. Here we go. So that's basically the middle point of the square wave. And here's the other point. I can invert them. Let's make them that way around. It's going to sound exactly the same. So we only have 2 manipulation points on a square wave using the tracking generator. This is why you need to be very careful about presuming that you can stretch. This is not a lag processor. This isn't the kind of thing where we can stretch moving from one modulation value to another. It's taking snapshots, and as far as square wave is concerned, there are only 2 data points that it cares about. Now, square wave inputs to tracking generators can be very cool. I came across a preset when I was preparing for this video. Let's have a look at the arpeggio preset. I'm not doing a full deep dive on this sound. I just want you to listen to the arpeggio nature of this preset, because this synthesizer doesn't have an arpeggiator, and yet is quite clearly generating some sort of arpeggio there. I'm just pressing a C. It's using the tracking generator to generate those extra pitches. Have a look over in the mod matrix. We've got 2 tracking generators plumbed into this thing, 1 and 2. And you can see that they're both tied in to the VCO1 frequency. And when we look at tracking generators 1 and 2, one of them is tied to LFO2, and the other one's tied to LFO4. LFOs 2 and 4 are both square waves, cycling actually at the host tempo. They're both locked to the host tempo, one in 1/8 triplets and one in half triplets. So they're both operating fairly quickly, cycling reasonably quickly. This 0.4 is rogue. It has nothing to do with the preset. It doesn't need to be there. It has no effect on the sound when you change that value. Only points 3 and 5 matter. But if I modulate points 3 and 5, we're going to get different variances of those two pitches. And obviously they're operating at different times as well, fundamentally different times. So you've got this really delicious kind of arpeggiated bounce thing going on. Very, very cool programming and a lovely example of how to use tracking generators creatively. And that'll do us for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.